The late afternoon sun was setting behind the courthouse as Judge Anderson walked to his car, his black judicial robes flowing behind him in the gentle breeze. It had been a long day of hearings, and he was looking forward to getting home to his family. The streetlights were just starting to flicker on as he carefully pulled out of the parking lot, making sure to signal at every turn. He hadn't driven more than 5 minutes when the flash of red and blue lights appeared in his rearview mirror. With over 20 years of legal experience, the judge knew exactly what to do. He calmly pulled over to the side of the road, turned off his engine, and placed both hands on the steering wheel where they could be clearly seen. Officer Wilson approached the car with his hand resting on his holster, flashlight beam cutting through the growing darkness. The judge noticed how the officer's body language changed when the light illuminated his face. A subtle shift in posture, a slight tightening of the jaw. Even after all these years, after all his accomplishments, these moments still carried a weight that sat heavy in his chest. License and registration, the officer demanded, his tone unnecessarily harsh. There was no good evening or explanation for the stop. The judge kept his movements slow and deliberate as he reached for his credentials. "Officer, I'm Judge Anderson from the county courthouse. May I ask why you've pulled me over?" His voice remained steady and professional, the same voice he used while presiding over his courtroom. He held out his driver's license along with his judicial identification. The officer barely glanced at the judicial ID. "You made an illegal turn back there," he said, though the judge knew with absolute certainty that he had signaled properly and followed all traffic laws. Years of experience had taught him to be especially careful about such things. "Sir, step out of the vehicle," the officer ordered, his hand still resting on his holster. The judge noticed a couple walking their dog had stopped to watch the scene unfold. Nearby, a teenager had pulled out their phone and started recording. A sad reality of modern times that sometimes proved necessary. As he carefully opened his door, his judicial robes caught the gleam of the police cruiser's spotlight. "Officer Wilson," he said, reading the nameplate. "I want to ensure you're aware that I'm a sitting judge in this county. I've just left the courthouse, and I can assure you I made no illegal turn." The officer's response was immediate and dismissive. "Being a judge doesn't put you above the law. Hands where I can see them." The disrespect in his tone was clear, a stark contrast to how the same officer might treat other legal professionals. Standing there on the side of the road, the distinguished judge was being treated like a common criminal. But within this humiliating moment, a thought began to form. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was an opportunity, a chance to create real change. As more phones came out to record the scene, the judge maintained his dignity and composure, knowing that his response in this moment could have far-reaching consequences. He thought about all the young people watching, about his own children, about the countless others who faced similar situations with far less protection than his judicial status afforded him. This encounter was quickly becoming more than just another traffic stop. It was becoming a moment that could spark meaningful dialogue and perhaps even lead to lasting change in their community. Back in his home office that evening, the judge sat quietly at his desk, his hands slightly shaking as he poured a glass of water. The events of the traffic stop kept replaying in his mind. His wife stood in the doorway, concern etched on her face as she watched him carefully write down every detail of the encounter while it was still fresh in his memory. "You should see your face right now," she said softly, walking over to place a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You look like you're carrying the weight of the world." The judge managed a small smile, reaching up to squeeze her hand. Their teenage son poked his head into the office, phone in hand, showing them that videos of the incident were already spreading across social media. The judge took a deep breath, straightening his posture. This was bigger than just one uncomfortable encounter. The dashboard camera in his car had captured everything, and combined with the bystander videos, there was now undeniable evidence of what so many people in their community had experienced but struggled to prove. Meanwhile, across town at the police station, Officer Wilson was finishing his shift report. His fingers hammered at the keyboard as he described a confrontational subject who attempted to use his position to avoid a citation. Deep down, something nagged at him, the memory of his own mother's voice telling him to always be fair, to treat others as he'd want to be treated. He pushed the thought aside, but it lingered. The next morning, the judge's phone wouldn't stop ringing. News outlets wanted statements. Community leaders were calling to express their support. But it was an email from a young law student that really caught his attention. "I saw what happened to you," the student wrote. "I've been thinking about quitting law school because I feel like nothing ever changes. But watching how you handled yourself, keeping your dignity while standing your ground, it gave me hope." The judge leaned back in his chair, thinking about all the times he told himself to just let these incidents go, to not make waves. But reading that email, he knew he couldn't stay quiet this time. This wasn't about revenge or punishment. It was about making things better for everyone, including the officers who carried their own burdens of fear and misunderstanding. He picked up his phone and called an old friend who worked as a police sergeant in another district. "I need your advice," he said. "I want to handle this the right way. Not to destroy careers, but to create change." They talked for over an hour, brainstorming ideas that went beyond the usual formal complaints and angry demands. That afternoon, the judge sat down to write 2 letters. The first was to the police chief, requesting a meeting not to file a complaint, but to discuss implementing a new type of training program. The second was to Officer Wilson himself, not with accusations or threats, but with an invitation to talk, person to person. As he sealed the envelopes, his wife came in with a cup of tea. "You're doing the right thing," she said, noting the determined look in his eyes. "Sometimes the hardest path is the one that leads to real change." The judge nodded, thinking about how one moment of disrespect could either spark more anger or become a catalyst for understanding. He chose the latter, knowing it wouldn't be easy but believing it would be worth it. The videos were still circulating, the comments growing heated, but he had a different vision, one where this incident could become a turning point for their community. The police chief's office felt smaller than usual that morning as 3 people sat around a heavy wooden desk, reviewing dashboard camera footage on a laptop. The chief kept rubbing his temples, while the head of internal affairs took detailed notes. The judge sat quietly, watching their reactions as his own traffic stop played out on the screen. "I've seen enough," the chief said, closing the laptop with a gentle click. His face showed the weariness of someone who had hoped these kinds of incidents were behind them. "Judge, I want to thank you for bringing this to us directly, and especially for how you're approaching it." The internal affairs captain opened a thick folder. "We've been reviewing Officer Wilson's past stops," she said, her voice professional but concerned. "There's a pattern here we can't ignore." She spread out several complaint forms, each telling a similar story. Routine stops that escalated unnecessarily, particularly with minority drivers. The judge leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "I'm not here to end anyone's career," he said. "But we need to address this head-on. Not just for Officer Wilson, but for everyone's sake." He pulled out his own folder, containing his proposal for a new training program. Meanwhile, word had spread through the police department. Officers gathered in small groups during shift changes, discussing the situation in hushed tones. Some defended Wilson, others shook their heads in disappointment. A veteran officer of 30 years pulled Wilson aside in the break room. "Listen," the older officer said, stirring his coffee. "I've been where you are, thinking you're doing the right thing, not realizing how your actions look from the other side. Maybe it's time to listen instead of defend." Wilson stood there, coffee untouched, thinking about the mounting evidence against him. He thought about his own kids, about the kind of world they were growing up in, about the kind of officer, the kind of person he wanted to be for them. Back at the courthouse, the judge was surprised by an unexpected visitor, a young rookie officer who had been present during one of Wilson's previous stops. I should have said something then, the rookie admitted, hands fidgeting with his cap. But I didn't know how. Now, watching how you're handling this situation, I knew I had to come forward. The investigation continued to unfold, but differently than most. Instead of just gathering evidence for punishment, they were gathering stories for change. Community members began coming forward, not with anger, but with hopes for improvement. Local business owners, teachers, and citizens of all backgrounds offered to participate in the proposed training program. The judge's phone rang that evening. It was the police chief again. "You need to see this," he said. "Officer Wilson just submitted a formal request to be part of the solution. He wants to help develop the training program, to share his perspective on how bias can cloud judgment even when you don't realize it." Sitting in his chambers later, reviewing all the developments, the judge felt a glimmer of hope. His wife had brought him dinner, knowing he'd be working late again. "You know what's different about this time?" she asked, perching on the edge of his desk. "People on both sides are starting to see each other as human beings." The judge nodded, looking at the growing stack of emails and letters on his desk. Messages from officers, community members, and fellow judges, all wanting to be part of the change. What had started as a tense traffic stop was becoming something much bigger. A chance for real understanding and transformation. The community center buzzed with nervous energy as people filed in for the first training session. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating rows of chairs arranged in a circle rather than the usual classroom style. The judge stood near the entrance, greeting each person who walked in, from rookie officers to veteran sergeants. Officer Wilson arrived last, hesitating at the doorway. The judge noticed his uniform was pressed extra crisp today, his boots polished to a mirror shine, small signs of both respect and anxiety. Their eyes met across the room, and the judge gave a slight nod, acknowledging the courage it took to be there. "We're doing something different today," the judge began, his voice carrying the same calm authority it held in his courtroom. "This isn't about pointing fingers or assigning blame. It's about understanding each other's stories." He picked up a small object from a nearby table, his father's old pocket watch. "This watch," he continued, "belonged to my father. He worked 2 jobs to put me through law school. Every morning, he'd look at this watch and say, 'Time waits for no one, son. Make every minute count.'" He passed the watch to the person next to him. "Everyone here has a story. Today, we're going to share them." As the watch made its way around the circle, stories emerged. A veteran officer spoke about growing up in a tough neighborhood, becoming a cop to make things better, but sometimes feeling caught between 2 worlds. A young officer shared her fears about making split-second decisions. When the watch reached Officer Wilson, his hands trembled slightly. "I always wanted to be one of the good guys," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But somewhere along the way, I started seeing threats instead of people. I forgot how to listen." The honesty in his voice touched something in the room, shifting the atmosphere from tension to possibility. The judge then pulled out his phone, playing the dashboard camera footage from their encounter. But instead of using it to accuse, he turned it into a teaching moment. "Let's break this down," he suggested. "What was each of us thinking? What were we afraid of? What could we have done differently?" As they analyzed the interaction, something unexpected happened. Officers started opening up about their own biases and fears. Community members shared their experiences. The discussion became real, raw, and honest. People who had walked in as adversaries began to see each other as human beings, each carrying their own burdens and hopes. During the break, Officer Wilson approached the judge. "I've been wanting to say something," he started, struggling to find the right words. "That night, when I pulled you over, I was wrong. But more than that, I was blind. Blind to my own prejudices." The judge listened, noting how different this man seemed from the officer who had stopped him that night. "The hardest steps are always the first ones," he replied. "But they're also the most important." As the session wrapped up, people lingered, forming small groups, exchanging contact information. The police chief, who had been quietly observing from the back, approached the judge. "This is different," he said. "Usually these trainings feel like checking boxes. But this feels like real change." Looking around the room, the judge saw something he hadn't expected. Hope. It wasn't just in the smiles and handshakes, but in the way people were making plans to continue these conversations, to bring others into the dialogue, to keep building bridges. His wife called as he was packing up. "How did it go?" she asked. The judge looked at Officer Wilson, now deep in conversation with a community youth leader, planning a ride-along program. "It's a beginning," he answered. "A real beginning." Rain drummed steadily on the windows of the police station's conference room, creating a gentle backdrop for what had become a weekly gathering. The judge sat at the head of the table, his tie loosened slightly, sharing a story he'd never told publicly before. "I was 12, he began, when my grandfather sat me down in his small barber shop. He'd lived through times I could hardly imagine, yet he never lost his belief in people's ability to change. He told me, success isn't just about climbing up, it's about reaching back to help others up too." The room fell silent, officers and community members alike leaning forward to listen. Officer Wilson, who now sat near the front instead of hiding in the back, found himself nodding. Over the past few weeks, these sessions had become less like formal training and more like family gatherings, where truth-telling was welcomed and vulnerability viewed as strength. "Growing up," the judge continued, "I delivered newspapers to help my mom make ends meet. One morning, a police officer stopped me. I was just a kid with a bike full of papers, but the way he looked at me." He paused, the memory still fresh. "That moment could have turned me bitter. Instead, my grandfather's words kept me focused on being part of the solution." A senior officer raised his hand, his weathered face showing emotion. "My first week on the job," he shared, "I was so focused on proving myself tough that I forgot about being human. Took me 20 years to understand what I was doing wrong. Some lessons come at a high price." Officer Wilson stood up next, surprising everyone. His voice shook slightly as he spoke. "Before these sessions, I thought I knew everything about being a good cop. But I was walking around with blinders on, not seeing the impact of my actions." He pulled out a small notebook. "I've been writing down every story shared here. Each one teaches me something new about myself." The conversation shifted to practical changes. Officers discussed how they'd modified their approach to traffic stops, taking an extra moment to see the person behind the wheel. Community members shared how their view of law enforcement had begun to evolve, seeing the human beings beneath the badges. During a coffee break, a young officer approached the judge with tears in her eyes. "My grandmother marched for civil rights," she said. "I became an officer to protect and serve, just like she fought for justice. But until now, I never fully understood how those two things could work together." The rain had stopped by the time they wrapped up, sunlight breaking through the clouds. Officer Wilson helped stack chairs, then turned to the judge. "You know what's strange?" he said. "I used to dread these sessions. Now they're the highlight of my week." In the parking lot, the judge noticed small groups lingering, exchanging phone numbers, and making plans for community cookouts and youth mentoring programs. What had started as mandatory training had grown into genuine friendship and understanding. Driving home, he called his wife. "Remember how worried we were about whether this would work?" he asked. She laughed softly. "Well, yesterday I saw Officer Wilson at the grocery store," she replied. "He was helping an elderly woman load her car. Small changes, but real ones." That evening, sitting in his study, the judge looked at an old photo of his grandfather's barbershop. He thought about how change doesn't always come in dramatic moments, but in quiet conversations, in stories shared, in barriers falling one by one. The true transformation wasn't just in new policies or procedures. It was in hearts and minds opening to new possibilities. 3 months after that fateful traffic stop, Officer Wilson stood before a mirror in the police station locker room. adjusting his uniform. But something was different now, not in his appearance, but in his eyes. The hard edge that once defined his gaze had softened into something more thoughtful, more aware. "Hey, you're going to do great," called out his partner, noticing his nervousness. Today was special. Officer Wilson would be leading his first community engagement session with a group of high school students. The same kids who once might have tensed up at the sight of his patrol car were now waiting to hear him speak. Walking into the school gymnasium, he was struck by the colorful banners the students had made. "Building bridges together, and change starts with understanding." His own teenage daughter had helped design them, proud of the transformation she'd witnessed in her father over these past months. "I'm not here to give you a lecture," he began, his voice carrying across the quiet gym. "I'm here to share a story about learning and unlearning." He pulled out the citation book from that night with the judge. Empty, never used. "This book used to be my shield, my way of maintaining control. Now it reminds me of the night everything changed." As he spoke, students leaned forward in their seats. He told them about growing up in a family of police officers, about the fear and pride that came with the badge, about how easy it was to let that fear turn into prejudice. Then he shared stories about the changes he experienced through the training program, the conversations that opened his eyes, the friendships that challenged his assumptions. During the question and answer session, a student raised her hand. "What's the hardest part about changing?" she asked. Officer Wilson thought for a moment. "Admitting you were wrong," he answered honestly. "But also realizing that changing doesn't make you weak, it makes you stronger." Later that afternoon, he responded to a routine traffic stop. As he approached the car, he remembered the judge's words about seeing the person, not just the situation. The driver was nervous, clutching the steering wheel. Instead of barking orders, Officer Wilson smiled, introduced himself, and explained why he pulled him over. The relief on the driver's face was immediate and profound. Back at the station, the chief called him into the office. "The feedback from your session today was outstanding," he said, sliding a folder across the desk. Inside was an application for the department's new community relations unit. "We need officers who understand both sides of the badge." That evening, Officer Wilson made an unexpected stop at the courthouse. The judge was still in his chambers, reviewing cases. "I wanted you to know," Wilson said, standing in the doorway, "that night you could have pushed for my badge. Instead, you pushed for my growth. I'll never forget that." The judge smiled, remembering their first encounter. "Sometimes our worst moments can lead to our best changes," he replied. They talked for an hour, not as a judge and officer, but as two men who had found common ground in their commitment to making things better. Driving home, Officer Wilson passed the spot where he pulled the judge over months ago. The street looked the same, but he was different. His phone buzzed, a text from a community member about the youth basketball program they were starting together. Another buzz, his daughter sending a proud message about his school presentation. He smiled, thinking about how change ripples outward. His transformed approach to policing had not only made him a better officer, but a better father, neighbor, and human being. The badge still shone on his chest, but now it reflected a different kind of strength, one built on understanding rather than authority. The city convention center hummed with excitement as people filed in for the first regional law enforcement conference. Badges from different counties glinted under the lights, mixing with civilian attendees from all walks of life. At the center of it all, the judge and Officer Wilson stood backstage, reviewing their notes one last time. "Did you ever think we'd be here?" Officer Wilson asked, adjusting his tie. That one traffic stop leading to all of this. He gestured at the packed auditorium through the curtain gap. Police chiefs from 3 states had come to learn about their community transformation program. The judge smiled, remembering the long journey. "Change is like a stone thrown in a pond," he said. "You never know how far the ripples will reach." His phone buzzed. Another department requesting their training materials. That made 28 departments in total now. As they walked onto the stage, the judge noticed something remarkable about the audience. Officers sat next to community activists, teenagers beside veterans, each there to learn how one city had begun to heal old wounds. The barriers that usually divided such groups seemed softer somehow, more permeable. "We're not here to tell you we've solved everything," the judge began, his voice carrying across the silent room. "We're here to share how we started making things better." He nodded to Officer Wilson, who stepped forward to share his part of their story. "6 months ago, I was that officer who saw threats instead of people," Wilson admitted, his honesty drawing the audience in. "Now I teach other officers how to break down their own barriers." He shared stories about their weekly community dinners, where officers and residents cooked together, about the youth mentoring program that had cut juvenile arrests in half. During the break, a tough-looking sergeant from another city approached them, wiping his eyes. "My daughter hasn't spoken to me in 2 years," he confessed. "She says I changed after joining the force, became too hard. Listening to you both today, maybe it's time I try to change too." Back in their own city, the impact kept growing. The local diner, once a place where officers ate at separate tables from everyone else, now hosted monthly coffee with cops, meetings that drew crowds so big they had to add extra chairs. The owner said he'd never seen so many genuine smiles in his restaurant. A young rookie officer, fresh from the academy, stopped Officer Wilson in the hallway. "I chose this city specifically," she said excitedly. "Everyone's talking about what's happening here. This is the kind of officer I want to be." The judge's chambers had become a regular stop for visitors wanting to learn more. Today, it was a police chief from 3 states away. "We've got similar problems in our city," the chief admitted. "But seeing what you've done here gives me hope. How did you get past the initial resistance?" The judge led him to the window overlooking the courthouse square. Below, officers and citizens mingled freely at the weekly farmers' market. "We stopped seeing it as us versus them," he explained. "Started seeing it as just us." That evening, as the sun set over the city, the judge and Officer Wilson sat in the park where they now held outdoor roll calls. Another new tradition that had helped break down walls. Kids played nearby, no longer running away when they saw a uniform. Parents chatted with officers they now knew by name. "You know what's amazing?" Officer Wilson said, watching a rookie officer helping a little girl fix her bicycle chain. "We're not just changing policies. We're changing hearts." The judge nodded, thinking about how far they'd come, and more importantly, how far they could still go. 2 years had passed since that fateful traffic stop. The judge stood at his chamber window, watching the morning sun illuminate the city streets below. His desk calendar showed a full day ahead, but not with just court cases. Now, his schedule included community outreach meetings and police training sessions that had become a regular part of his duties. His phone lit up with a message from Officer Wilson, now promoted to training supervisor. "You won't believe the numbers," the text read. "Complaints down 70%. Community trust ratings at an all-time high." The judge smiled, remembering how it all started with one moment that could have gone very differently. Walking through the police station later that morning, he noticed the changes that might seem small to outsiders, but meant everything to those who remembered how things used to be. The walls, once bare except for regulations and wanted posters, now displayed photos of officers at community events, playing basketball with kids, helping elderly residents, sharing meals with families. In the briefing room, Officer Wilson was teaching a new batch of recruits. His training style had become legendary, not just locally, but across the state. "Your badge is not a wall," he told them, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "It's a bridge. Your uniform doesn't separate you from the community, it connects you to it." The judge paused in the doorway, listening. A young recruit raised her hand. "Sir, is it true that you used to be?" She hesitated, searching for the right words. Officer Wilson nodded, understanding. "I was the officer who needed to change the most," he said. And that's why I can tell you, change is always possible. Later that afternoon, they both attended a graduation ceremony at the local high school. The valedictorian, a young student who had once feared the police, was heading to college to study criminal justice. "I want to be part of the change," she announced in her speech, smiling at Officer Wilson, who had become her mentor. The community center, where it had all started, was now a hub of activity. The weekly dialogue sessions had grown into daily programs: youth mentoring, job training, family support services. Officers didn't just patrol the neighborhood anymore, they were part of it. They knew the names of the kids, the struggles of the families, the dreams of the community. That evening, a special ceremony was held in the city hall. The mayor presented awards to both the judge and Officer Wilson for their work in transforming police-community relations. But the real reward wasn't the plaques or the recognition. It was in the faces of the people filling the room. Officers and citizens, standing together, talking, laughing, sharing stories. A reporter asked them both to sum up what had changed in 2 years. The judge looked at Officer Wilson, then back at the crowd. "We stopped seeing differences," he said, "and started seeing possibilities." Officer Wilson nodded, adding, "We learned that the strongest kind of authority comes from respect, not fear." As the ceremony wrapped up, a group of rookie officers approached them. "We chose this department specifically," one said, "because we heard this is where real change happens." The judge watched as Officer Wilson took them under his wing, just as he had done with so many others. Walking to their cars later, they passed the spot where their story began. "Sometimes I drive by here on purpose," Officer Wilson admitted, "to remind myself how far we've come." The judge nodded, understanding completely. That spot was no longer a reminder of division. It had become a symbol of transformation. The city streets were quiet now, but not with the tense silence of the past. This was a peaceful quiet, the kind that comes with trust and understanding. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities for growth. But now they had a blueprint for change, a living example of how justice and compassion could work together to build something better.